Castlevania, SMT, and the Dark Souls series. What do they all have in common? Dark Souls 3 is probably my favorite Souls game with how amazing the world design, lore, and bosses are. With Dark Souls 3 being the final Souls game in the Dark Souls trilogy, it's basically a continuation from Dark Souls 1, specifically not Dark Souls 2 since that game was kind of a fever dream. I recently had the joy of playing through Dark Souls 3 for the first time with some friends of mine watching my playthrough, and I'm not gonna lie, I definitely think it elevated my experience than if I were to play it alone.
Time for
The Souls series is of course known for its amazing use of world building and atmosphere and overall setting to tell its story, with item descriptions also being very important in informing you on ongoing events, with cutscenes only really being used to show off the imposing bosses before you. Saying any Souls game is your favorite is basically a hot take as they all kinda shine for their own reasons, like Sekiro for its beautiful rendition of Sengoku Japan and fast-paced gameplay, Elden Ring for its creative visuals and seemingly boundless open world, and Bloodborne for its immersive gothic atmosphere and amazing lore. And of course Dark Souls 2 for being absolutely peak. Dark Souls 3 essentially takes place many years in the future after Dark Souls 1, with the many areas and prefectures essentially evolving into the areas of Dark Souls 3, with the traces of people and beings that once roamed the land being left behind, or evolving into something much greater than before. A good example of this would be Smo's hammer. Smo, alongside his buddy Ornstein, would be one of the most iconic boss duos of Dark Souls 1, a perfect blend of strategy and tension given Ornstein's fast-paced nature and Smo's slow yet devastating attacks. Smo's hammer from Dark Souls 1 would be a usable weapon here, though of course you would need the proper stats to wield it. Thankfully, with the power of strength build and my new Smo hammer, I was kind of able to make a lot of the bosses look like a joke. The beautiful city of Honor Londo in Dark Souls 1 would become a desolated and decaying husk of its former self in Dark Souls 3, and even the minor things like when you get your first Estus flask is kind of different in this game. When starting Dark Souls 1, you would end up getting your first Estus flask from a knight named Oscar of Astora, and in Dark Souls 3, his body remains in the Cemetery of Ash, giving you your first Estus flask to start off your new journey. There's of course many more of these littered throughout the game, as Dark Souls 3 is basically a culmination of previous areas and kingdoms that's either fallen or evolved over time. The boss design also having some of the best in the series. With every boss being fast and in your face, it becomes pretty exciting to fight and learn them. There's usually a lot going on with every boss fight, and I'd say just about every boss kind of pushes you into an aggressive playstyle, some more so than the others. Bosses like Pontiff and Gundyr, for example, would have a lot of combo extenders to push you back, and they would ultimately have minimal opening windows. It would give you the illusion that they don't stop attacking, when in reality you would just have to really learn their attack patterns in order for you to take advantage of their blind spots. It kinda seems like after releasing Bloodborne, FromSoft just went all in on releasing more fast-paced fights, as they seem to be more mechanically interesting, and they would also have the freedom to mess around with boss attacks and overall flow of combat. With there of course being bosses unique to Dark Souls 3, there would also be some bosses like Dragon Slayer armor and Aldrich that originated from Dark Souls 1 and would carry into Dark Souls 3 for lore reasons. Overall, I feel like there's something for everyone here, whether you're coming from Dark Souls 1 or an entirely new player to the series. Well, as much as I want to fawn over the world and lore behind some of the areas in this game, I think that a big part of my enjoyment went towards the bosses and weapon designs. Every boss that you go up against in Dark Souls 3, besides the Crystal Sage, has not only some of the coolest designs, but also some of the most interesting backstories in the Soul series, with bosses like Pontiff, Yorm, and Gundyr being some of my favorites design-wise. Every boss that you fight has a role in the story to fulfill, with some being guardians protecting a great evil, and some that were more so like the player, only to lose themselves into madness. Dark Souls 3, unlike any other Souls game before it, is also a very fast-paced game. Dark Souls 1 and 2 were generally slower and arguably less mechanically demanding than just about everything in Dark Souls 3. And the easiest example of this would have to be the tutorial bosses from Dark Souls 1 and 2 compared to 3, where Asylum Demon from DS1 and Last Giant from DS2 were big and slow with easy to dodge attacks. The tutorial boss in Dark Souls 3 is a multi-phase demon that will probably destroy you if you're unfamiliar with Souls-like gameplay. Gundyr would serve as the first actual challenge boss in the game, basically being your first roadblock and mental torment that will start you off your journey. That, and I'm also pretty sure they wanted to kick out any game journalists lurking around. Gundyr was once a champion of Ash himself, and kind of like the player, he had the goal of linking the flame. But after arriving too late, he found a firelink shrine void of fire and he fell into darkness. After impaling himself with a coiled sword, he then became a judge of those trying to leave the Cemetery of Ash, and he would test them through combat if they want to link the flame once more. Even during the fight with him, there's a really cool detail around his second phase where the abyss within him would start becoming more active. It would not only engulf him completely, but it would also start violently attacking you, gaining new moves to the already difficult Gundyr. Though this was still somewhat of a walk in the park given how it's one of the first bosses that you fight. Gundyr overall wasn't much of an issue for me until I fought him again later on in the game. Champion Gundyr would be a different version of Udix Gundyr that actually made me want to slam my head into the wall. Oh my god. Champion Gundyr is essentially the same boss, but his aggression is just turned up to 11. Getting hits on him is pretty difficult as he's just constantly attacking. But I guess that's just what made this boss fight so much fun for me. I had many little openings to hit Gundyr, and the smallest mistake would lead to him utterly destroying me. Okay. And after going at this fight for literally 2 hours straight, I came up with an idea. Gundyr's greatest strength was his rapid attacks that would stagger and shove me to the ground, so after replacing some of my armor with none other than Smo himself, I would finally be able to hold my ground and not get absolutely smacked up by him.
Just have the Smo drip on and fat roll, like how bad can it be?
I'm gonna have my... Bro, his fucking weight.
Oh, bro, it's mad as hell.
Bro, why is this so funny to me? And after a few attempts, I was able to overcome Gundyr, with Smo once again helping me from the grave. Another boss that I absolutely adored was the iconic Abyss Watchers. Yeah, this was a boss that I've heard praise about since way before I even decided to play any Souls games. With friends of mine who haven't even played Dark Souls 3 still mentioning how cool the Abyss Watchers fight is. And admittedly, this would have to be one of my favorite fights in the game. The Abyss Watchers is a mandatory fight that you would encounter fairly early into the game, and instead of fighting a giant monstrosity like usual, you would instead be fighting another knight more so closer to yourself in terms of design and gameplay. The Abyss Watchers' sole purpose was to protect the world against the dark forces of the Abyss, hence the name. They idolized Knight Artorias, which makes a lot of sense given the design, and were some of the fastest warriors in Lothric. With some of the Abyss Watchers left to guard the abyss below, some of them started to go hollow, and with it spreading within them, they all started to slowly lose themselves into utter madness, and eventually the abyss. The Abyss Watchers now end up fighting against themselves, endlessly corrupted by the Abyss, which is why the boss arena is just filled with their bodies scattered around the arena. During the boss fight, you're of course fighting the head honcho, but there's also hollowed Abyss Watchers that show up mid-fight to keep it interesting. Watcher 1, as I call him, is another enemy that awakens mid-fight who will also attack you. You kinda gotta watch out for both Watchers, as any little mistake will lead to you getting comboed by both of them. A little bit after Watcher 1 spawns in, another Abyss Watcher will arise from the ground, and I could not have been caught more off guard than when Watcher 2 enters the fight. Watcher 2 is pretty interesting because he isn't just another enemy that will attack you. Watcher 2 is so corrupted by the Abyss that he will straight up attack anything that comes near him, and I'm also pretty sure that's why he has glowing red eyes. I found the best way to utilize him is to stay away from him and let him go to work on Watcher 1 or the boss itself. The Abyss Watcher's fast sword swings and close-up dagger attacks are very fun to dodge and avoid, and it gives the fight a very fun dynamic that I've only experienced with a select few bosses. He's fast and hard-hitting, but also doesn't have any combo extenders and has a lot of openings to punish. And now combine the boss with Watcher 1 who also attacks you and Watcher 2 who can possibly help you, and you have one of the best fights in the game. And it's really satisfying to see it all pan out in your favor, until you reach his second phase. Does he have another phase?
You see, you would have been distressed that he had another phase if you didn't kill him in like 5 hits.
The second phase is a more standard boss fight where there just being one Abyss Watcher that you have to take down. The fallen Abyss Watcher would end up taking the strength of his fallen brothers and would not only become embered, but his sword would also become engulfed in fire. Here he is faster, stronger, and trickier, with the flame from his sword acting as a delayed hit, so you would have to really calculate your dodges better. Along with this, he would have charge attacks where he would lunge at you and his flames would emerge from the ground. A great fight with equally good lore behind it. With a bit of luck, I didn't take too long to defeat him, as he just didn't stand much of a chance against the strength build gut sword combo. But still a legendary fight that is honestly up there with one of my favorite Soulsborne bosses. The only one that I would hold higher than the Abyss Watchers would have to be my favorite boss, Slave Knight Gale. If you're even remotely into the Soul series, then you've probably heard of Slave Knight Gale at some point. This would be the last boss of the Painted World DLC, and also be the finale to finish off the entire Soul series trilogy. Gale was a warrior who you can find in the base game as just a normal guy who was, funnily enough, trying to find something called the Dark Soul. Our Dark Soul!
Is Gwyn not the soul of Gundyr?
But upon finding the Dark Soul, he also finds out that it's contaminated with the blood of the first pygmy, and upon digesting it, Gale would fall into insanity and become hollow. But unlike the many bosses in this game that start off as noble people with good intentions only for them to go hollow and lose sight of what's important, Slave Knight Gale wanted this to happen. To carry out his mission, we would have to kill him and take his blood, which is pretty fitting given that the place that we're in now is a destroyed and ruined world. And the entire fight would take place in the future, where you and Gale are the last two living people in the decaying world. Gale starts off with a pretty normal attack pattern with nothing too crazy. He most notably has this one move where he can impale you and fling you across the arena if you aren't careful enough.
Yeah, I don't think you can riposte a Gale. I don't think he has like a down.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Oh, you're fucking
Bro. He is a little sporadic given his attacks and stance, but this is all fairly easy to deal with, until you reach his second phase. He literally starts the phase off with Sigma walking towards you and has a lot more moves up his arsenal. His sword would swing around like normal, but the flames attached to the sword would also register for another hit, making your dodges a lot scarier since you can still evade his first attack, but his delayed flames can still get you. The only other boss to have a feature like this would be the Abyss Watchers phase 2. Along with flame delays, Gale would have air attacks, boomerang spells, and a crossbow to light you up if you try to heal on him.
Oh, he has a blick, by the way, so I'd watch out for that.
Oh shit.
He'll try to blick you when you heal.
He'll try to blick you.
Bro wasn't lying.
that is not the blink, that's the fucking block, bro.
His boomerang spell would also whip back at you later, just in case you forget about them. And when he goes into phase 3, he would end up doing an AoE attack, and the skies would get dark and lightning would start to strike everywhere. Every attempt it took me to win was an attempt that I thoroughly enjoyed, and there couldn't have been a better boss fight to send off the Dark Souls trilogy than Slave Knight Gale. And of course, there's much more bosses in Dark Souls 3 that are arguably just as good as the bosses that I highlighted. Every boss has its own patterns, strategies, and amazing lore behind it that really makes the world come full circle. Every victory is amazing given the challenge, but also saddening given the person you took down was probably a noble person who's just been twisted and hollowed. It's eerily depressing, but also poetic in a sense, as you're not only taking them down for good, but you're also carrying out their wishes and overall mission with you onto the journey ahead. It's a pretty large appeal of how I even got into the Soul series to begin with, and these stories almost never have a happy ending. It's basically just to pick your poison of which tragic ending would you rather experience. But aside the bosses of Dark Souls 3, one of the most tragic and eerily beautiful features of this game is the art and design of the world itself. The world of Dark Souls 3 is the definition of hopeless and depressing, but as bleak and creepy as it looks, I couldn't help but appreciate just how well it all came together. Dreadful atmosphere has always been one of the strong suits of the Souls games, but I feel like the atmosphere was just really nailed in some of the areas in this game. I'd honestly say that Dark Souls 3 reminds me of Bloodborne in some aspects, which is really interesting given a lot of the areas of this game were based off of Dark Souls 1. Some of the areas in this game give off a light gothic aesthetic with how the kingdoms and cathedrals look to the red sky illuminating overhead. While these levels are in the earlier parts of the game, it does give off a really creepy and isolated vibe that sets the tone pretty well. And while most people would probably agree that Dark Souls 1 has one of, if not the best level design due to its interconnected areas, Dark Souls 3's level design is also very good. While you would just unfortunately have your average Souls level to get lost in, every level is mostly memorable for its well-crafted design and attention to detail. My only problematic level that I came across that I just really didn't like was a Poison Swamp. This is an area from this game that just really sucked with very minimal redeeming factors. Swamp areas in Souls games are never the highlight, but at least Blighttown from Dark Souls 1 had a purpose and was memorable for making you feel lost and helpless to an extent. The Poison Swamp in Dark Souls 3 is just very dull with extremely annoying enemies back to back. Moving slowly combined with poison tick damage and actually some of the most annoying enemies that only move in packs was definitely something that almost drove me to the edge.
Why are they following me, bro? Oh my god. Oh my god.
And on top of that, there are items like Estus shards that you're gonna want, which you have to slowly move around the swamp to get. The only redeeming factor for me is the fact that I got to fight Abyss Watchers as they are located here in the swamp. Where the game would really pick up its amazing and haunting atmosphere would be when you reach a place called Irithyll.
Bro,
Pumpo.
he's just taking it in.
I took a Steam screenshot. This would have to be one of my favorite areas in the game, and honestly for good reason. Irithyll is a beautiful city that you would come across, built around the city of the gods from Dark Souls 1, aka Anor. It has a really pretty silver, white, and blue color palette to it, and with the constant snow over the city, it gives a really magical feeling. And exploring it is just as amazing as well. And the enemies within the city contribute really well to the already amazing scenery of Irithyll, with the knights wearing long see-through robes on top of their silver and blue coated armor. And having to traverse through the Irithyll dungeons, you would learn that Irithyll also has a very dark past of experimenting on their slaves and using them in inhumane ways. And through all the sights, at the end of Irithyll, which would be its highest point, you would actually end up coming across Anor itself. This is absolutely amazing on so many different levels. On one hand, this is not only a callback to one of the most iconic levels in the Souls franchise, but also seeing that Anor is still standing after all these years was an amazing way to end off such a wonderful area. Here's where I found the Smo Hammer and proceeded to use it for the rest of my playthrough. There's also some more references here like the hallway where you fight Gundyr and a photo of Guinevere from DS1. Anor wouldn't take too much of your time, as it's really just used as a boss run back for Pontiff, another great boss of this game. While I believe Dark Souls 3's atmosphere peaked with Irithyll, the other areas of this game are mesmerizing in their own way. The Dreadkeep and Ring City DLC for one is a collage of previous Souls areas formed into one, and the other is an amazing, almost futuristic city used as a really cool backdrop to look at, though most of it is just unfortunately spent underground in a dungeon. While the underground dungeons weren't horrible, there was just a bit too much of them, with most levels starting off with beautiful scenic backdrops and architecture, only for you to end up spending a majority of the level inside of a building or underground. But overall, the atmosphere would stay relatively consistent, with every area having a unique feel and tone tied to it. And for how much fun I had playing this game for the first time, I see why Dark Souls 3 is still extremely popular and loved. While it wasn't too creative in trying new things, it kinda just blended a bunch of great stuff that FromSoft already did into this, and combined all of these aspects with the lore of this game, and there could not have been a better way to end off the Dark Souls series. I should probably go to the grave.